Have you ever wondered why a recent, seemingly, well, ordinary high-level trade negotiation could completely change the way we look at who holds the true global power?
Yeah, and why those initial reports, the headlines, mostly got it backwards.
Exactly. It was fascinating, wasn't it? The headline screamed victory for Washington based on some, let's say, limited concessions.
But if you actually look past that noise, look at the fine print from that U.S.-China meeting in Korea,
Yeah.
the whole narrative just sort of unravels.
And that's what we want to get into today, moving past the spin. Because Korea wasn't just, a trade truce.
No, not at all. It felt much bigger.
It was the moment the United States was fundamentally forced, I think, to confront and publicly accept China as a geopolitical and economic peer.
Basically ending that whole era where the U.S. was the only undisputed heavyweight champion.
Right. This is the official dawn of the G2 dynamic. We're talking about a rewrite of foundational global policy.
It really is. It's
Yeah.
not just about tariffs anymore. It's about acknowledging this permanent shift in power. And that ripples across everything.
How allies behave, how the Western media even frames China.
Exactly. It changes the whole game.
Okay, let's unpack this huge development. Maybe start with the basics, the specifics of the Korea talks.
Good idea. The trade scorecard. What did each side actually agree to give up?
Let's start with the U.S. side. What did Washington concede?
Well, the U.S. concessions, when you really look at them, they're quite staggering. Washington essentially agreed to undo its own self-inflicted economic damage.
Which is usually a sign of, well, desperation, right?
Pretty much. First, they lowered tariffs on those fentanyl-related goods, dropped them from 20%.
Yeah, to 10%. Okay.
Yeah, a significant drop.
That's a humanitarian angle, sure, but it's also economic relief for Chinese manufacturers. What else did the U.S. give up?
Well, the biggest technical giveaway, I'd say, was suspending the 50% expansion of the entity list.
Right, the entity list. That's basically the U.S. trade blacklist.
Exactly. If you're on it, like Huawei was, you're pretty much cut off from buying essential U.S. parts, components.
So suspending the expansion meant?
It meant the U.S. stepped back from potentially paralyzing a whole new wave of Chinese tech firms that were likely expecting to be targeted next.
So the U.S. took its foot off the accelerator, maybe even off the neck, of China's critical tech development.
You can put it that way.
Right.
But the really shocking concession, the one that shifted the ground, involved the wider tariff war.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. The major world-altering concession was walking back the nuclear option. That threat of imposing truly crushing 100% tariffs on a huge range of goods.
Instead of escalating.
Instead of escalating, the U.S. government settled on a 10% tariff rate for the next 12 months.
Wow, 100% versus 10%. That's a massive retreat.
Huge. After months, even years, of global economic chaos, using tariffs as a weapon, they basically ended up back at the standard rate.
The rate they charge almost everyone else, including allies in Europe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It really exposes a fundamental flaw in the original trade war strategy. It suggests the U.S. had run out of political runway, maybe run out of time.
And leverage.
And leverage. This is where that great line comes from.
Yeah.
The U.S. acting as both the arsonist and the firefighter.
Right, starting the fire and then wanting applause for putting out a bit of it.
Precisely. They inflicted the economic pain, higher costs, hitting their own manufacturers, and then asked for credit for agreeing not to inflict even more damage. The return to 10% really confirms the tariff war lacked a sustainable goal beyond just temporary pressure.
But couldn't you argue, maybe, that walking away from 100% tariffs was actually a smart tactical move? Showed flexibility, created space for talks?
Tactically, perhaps. It probably helped avoid a deeper global recession, yes. But strategically, it signals failure.
How so?
Well, the entire point of those escalating tariffs, the threat of 100%, was supposed to force structural economic change inside China. Deep changes.
And settling for 10% didn't achieve that.
Not even close. It confirmed that domestic pressure, inflation, businesses screaming for stability, the pressure outweighed the big strategic goal of containing China. They basically traded long-term leverage for short-term economic relief at home.
Okay. So, the U.S. gave up maximum leverage. Big concessions, what did they get back? Were the Chinese concessions, dollar for dollar equal?
No, not really. The Chinese returns were largely superficial or things they were going to do anyway.
Yeah.
Or just recycled promises. It confirms they gave up less.
Okay, like what?
Beijing agreed to lift its recently tightened controls on rare earth exports for 12 months. That helps global supply chains, sure.
Okay, what else? The famous soybeans.
Ah, yes, the soybeans. China agreed to resume buying American soybeans, which It's almost insulting, isn't it?
It cuts.
Because resuming soybean purchases is only a concession if you forget they stopped buying them because of the trade war the U.S. started in the first place.
Huh. Right, so it's just going back to how things were before.
Exactly. It's a return to the status quo ante on a relatively minor agricultural point. And Beijing can easily turn that tap off again if they want.
Any other concessions from China?
Well, they did pledge to crack down more on the export of those precursor chemicals used in fentanyl production. That's a genuine win for the U.S. domestic fight against opioids, definitely.
Okay, that's something concrete.
It is. But the rest, mostly vague stuff. General commitments on energy cooperation, a promise to find a solution for platforms like TikTok, very nonspecific.
So the overall consensus among economists seems pretty clear then.
Undeniable, really.
Yeah.
China came out of this phase having conceded less and having forced the U.S. to back down from its maximum pressure campaign.
And that core assumption driving the trade war hawk.
That China needed the U.S. more than the U.S. needed China. That illusion is officially shattered. Kaput.
Which is the critical takeaway, right? That fundamental misunderstanding.
Absolutely. And now we pivot. We move from the economics to the diplomacy, the language.
That brings us right to the next really crucial point. The diplomatic and, well, the rhetorical fallout from that meeting. Because right after the talks, the U.S. leader made this monumental statement on social media, of all places.
That post-meeting statement on Truth Social?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was genuinely historic. The U.S. leader described the talks as, quote, a great one for both of our countries.
Both of our countries.
And then famously aspired to, quote, everlasting peace and success. God bless both China and the USA.
Wow. That shift in language is just enormous. We went from trade war, economic rival, existential threat,
to everlasting peace and mutual success.
Yeah.
Praying for your rival's success.
So what's the real diplomatic implication there? When the leader of the world's, previously recognized sole superpower publicly blesses the success of his main competitor.
I mean, it's basically an official public admission. You could almost call it a diplomatic white flag. It signals that the United States' time as the only global superpower, that unipolar moment everyone talked about, it's over. When you publicly wish for the success of your competitor, you're recognizing them as a permanent fixture, and crucially, as a peer. We are now formally in the G2 world. It's been accepted at the highest level.
That's the highest form of diplomatic recognition possible, isn't it? An acceptance of power parity.
It really is. And think about the secondary message this G2 focus sends. Who does that statement leave out?
The old allies, the G7.
Exactly. Canada, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan. For decades, the G7 was, the exclusive club. They basically ran the global economic and security show.
So this is the G7 slap people talked about.
You could definitely call it that. By publicly blessing China and framing it as a G2, the U.S. leader essentially, maybe unintentionally, demoted his oldest allies to the B team, perhaps.
Suggesting he sees them as less powerful, less important now than Beijing.
That's certainly how it could be interpreted. And we've already seen the ripples, haven't we, in Asia?
You mean Japanese Prime Minister Takashi Sanane?
Exactly. Formerly known as a pretty solid China hawk. And then suddenly, right after the Korea talks, he turns on a dime, starts actively pursuing stable ties with Beijing.
It's pure pragmatism, isn't it?
It's the ultimate pragmatic response. If the top dog, the leading Western power, is publicly saying, China's my equal now, we're the G2, well, regional allies have to adjust. They can't afford to be caught in the middle of a fight. The U.S. isn't fully committed to winning anymore.
And what's also fascinating is how quickly this whole shift seems to have been, absorbed, maybe even embraced by mainstream Western media, cementing this new reality.
Oh, the coverage was a huge signal, a bellwether for this new reality. Just look at the language in the headlines right after the summit.
What did they say?
CNN stated flat out that regardless of the details, the meeting itself was a symbolic win for China. The Financial Times admitted China emerged as a recognized peer rival.
Peer rival?
And The Guardian, I thought, summed it up really well. They said, America discovered that bullies can be bullied back. Punchy.
And this isn't just anecdotal, based on a few headlines. There's data.
Exactly. There's statistical evidence. A major study looked at coverage across 10 big U.S. and U.K. news outlets, CNN, BBC, New York Times, places like that. They tracked the tone on China's economy, tech, environment.
Okay, and what did they find?
Back in 2019, peak trade war hostility, nearly 70% of those stories had a distinctly negative spin. 70%.
Wow, okay. And what about after this shift, moving into 2025?
That share of negative stories, it dropped. precipitously, down to around 40%.
40%, that's a huge change.
Huge. And it corresponds with a significant confirmed increase in neutral coverage. And crucially, a more universal recognition of China's actual economic and technological achievements.
Yeah, you can almost feel it in your own newsfeed, can't you? Back in 2019, every China story felt like it was about IP theft or currency manipulation or human rights abuses.
Right, this standard negative framing.
Now you're seeing more articles acknowledging their breakthroughs in, say, quantum computing or big infrastructure projects or their massive role in the global EV market.
That shift isn't accidental. It's policy and perception following the reality on the ground.
And that change in narrative is vital, right? Because it kills that illusion we talked about earlier.
Absolutely essential. It removes that false political belief that Beijing was desperate, that they needed the U.S. more. Once the media narrative accepts China as a successful peer, well, policy options that were politically toxic under the old strategic competition banner suddenly become plausible.
Which leads us right to the future, then. This idea of peaceful coexistence. We're seeing this emerging consensus, even among some traditionally hawkish foreign policy types in Washington.
Yeah, think tanks that used to beat the competition drum nonstop.
They're now talking about moving past strategic competition, establishing a, quote, normal relationship.
And what does normal relationship mean in this G2 world? It's actually pretty simple.
What is it?
The U.S. has to give up the idea of ever being the sole global superpower again. Just accept it's not coming back.
It's about accepting that the two big nationalistic agendas, GA here and the Great Rejuvenation over in China, they don't have to be fundamentally at odds.
Right. They could actually, theoretically, support each other's rise, or at the very least, just agree not to constantly obstruct each other's economic progress.
Because both leaders prioritize domestic economic stability and national pride above all else, maybe.
That seems to be the calculation. If both sides agree on boundaries, define their spheres, they can focus on that stability instead of constant global ideological battles.
So what would a framework for this future G2 relationship actually look like? In practice, where could cooperation actually happen?
Well, the emerging vision seems to focus on two key areas. First, establishing mutually beneficial economic investment zones with clear, agreed-upon boundaries.
So both sides feel like they're gaining something. It's not zero-sum.
Exactly. Avoids that constant feeling of trying to win every single interaction. And second, the really thorny issue, Taiwan. The new consensus seems to be advocating for diplomatic de-escalation there as the ultimate symbol of this new normal relationship.
Which would involve?
It would likely involve the U.S. formally reconsidering its stance on Taiwanese independence, maybe stepping back from overt support in exchange for Beijing significantly scaling back its military posturing, its rhetoric in the region.
That kind of big, high-stakes diplomatic trade-off, it certainly fits the mold of a deal-making administration, doesn't it? Someone wanting to be seen as the peace president.
It's arguably the most realistic path forward now. It's not built on wishful thinking or trying to impose one ideology. It's built on finally truly recognizing power parity.
The Korean talks basically force Washington's hand, force them to accept reality.
That seems to be the case.
Okay, so let's try to sum this up. Two undeniable facts seem to have fundamentally changed the dynamic between these two giants.
First, the U.S. was bested in the trade war. Let's just say it.
Right.
The cards, as the saying goes, were ultimately made in China.
Okay. And second?
Second, the media narrative, the way we talk about China in the West, has officially shifted to reflect this new power parity. And that makes a normal, less hostile relationship seem much more possible.
These two facts have created a completely new foundation for the world order.
They really have.
Which leaves us with that final provocative question for you, the listener, to think about. Does this newfound public acceptance of the G2 structure, triggered by what seemed like just another trade meeting in Korea, does it represent just a temporary tactical retreat for the U.S., a pause before the next round of confrontation?
Or is this revolutionary new vision, one based on finally recognizing true power parity, actually the most realistic and maybe the most enduring path forward for the world?
Something to definitely mull over as these geopolitical tectonic plates keep shifting under our feet.